By the time the bell rang, Noah was asleep against my chest, and the Lake Forest townhouse felt too still for the 4 people outside my door. Trent stood closest in a navy coat, Judith beside him with both hands on her purse, Victor Ames behind them, and Mallory Keene lingering like bad timing. The minute Trent glanced past me and said, "I just want to see my son," I knew they had not come for love. Only control. Judith lifted her chin and pressed. "Lydia. Really?" Keeping family on the porch, while Victor stayed silent and Mallory studied my entryway like she was measuring a future. I shifted Noah higher against my shoulder, felt his breath through my shirt, and said, "You're not coming inside," because that line sounded different once I meant it. Trent gave me the donor smile he used when rooms turned difficult and murmured, "Let's not do this here," but he had already chosen where it would happen. Then he looked past me again and asked, softer now, "Where is my son?" And that was when I understood he believed arrival could erase absence. I looked at him, then at Victor, and asked, "What baby?" And the whole porch went still enough for Judith's breath to catch in her throat. "The baby you told me to take a car service for at 2 a.m, I said, keeping my voice level. "That baby you suddenly came to claim?" Trent let out one thin laugh and tried. I was half asleep, but I could still see his hand turning the phone face down before he switched it off. "At 2:11 my water broke. At 2:19, you told me to call a car. At 2:21, you shut your phone off. At 6:14 texted, 'Everything okay?' Mallory whispered. You told me she had the baby later." And that single sentence landed hardest because it told Victor exactly who Trent had briefed. A week earlier, before that porch and before Trent learned that chronology could strip the polish off a man faster than anger ever could, our life still photographed beautifully. I built private dinners for women who wore restraint like jewelry, and Trent moved through donor rooms with the smooth confidence of a man who believed charm counted as character. From the outside, we looked balanced, established, and expensive in the quiet American way that makes people assume nothing ugly could possibly be happening indoors. The evidence never arrived as one dramatic betrayal, which was why I kept misnaming it as pressure, timing, or a hard season instead of calling it neglect with good lighting. 2 weeks before I went into labor, Trent moved my prenatal appointment for a breakfast he called essential, then left the reschedule email sitting in our shared inbox like it meant nothing. 3 days after that, I noticed the same River North valet charge appear again on a card he had already described as donor hospitality, and I let the explanation pass because I was tired. Mallory Keene existed at first the way certain women do around men like Trent. Never centered. Never named too often. Always drifting in through photos, tags, and mutual event chatter. Once, while I was reviewing seating notes at the kitchen counter, Trent flipped his phone face down so quickly, the movement itself landed harder than whatever had been on the screen. Another time Judith called to remind me, with that polished maternal patience she used like a blade, that pregnancy was no time to become suspicious, difficult, or publicly emotional. I remember standing in my own pantry later that afternoon with a grocery list in one hand and that sentence still hanging in the air, because it clarified what role they all preferred for me. Trent could redirect appointments, hide screens, and vanish into donor work. Judith could frame silence as dignity, and I was supposed to make every missing piece look intentional. So when I woke at 2:11 a.m., with warmth running down my legs and my palm braced against the hallway wall, I was not stepping out of a good marriage into one bad night. I was stepping into the first honest minute of it. I crossed the hall with one hand under my stomach and the other on the wall, feeling each step turn heavier as pressure gathered low and mean through my back. When I touched Trent's shoulder, he made an irritated sound before he opened his eyes, like I had woken him for something minor instead of the birth of his child. I whispered, "My water broke," then breathed through the next contraction and added, I need to go now. Because there was no gentler version left. He pushed himself up on one elbow, squinted at the clock, and looked at the wet hem of my sleep shirt with the dull annoyance of a man being inconvenienced. Then he rubbed his face, muttered, "Call a car service." And I stood there long enough to make sure the words had really come out of his mouth. When I said, "I can't drive like this," he pulled the blanket higher and answered, "I have that breakfast in the morning." Nothing in his voice sounded confused or half asleep anymore, which was why the next thing mattered more than the sentence itself. He reached for his phone, turned it face down on the nightstand, and shut the screen off with the calm, deliberate movement of someone protecting sleep. In that second, the room told the truth more clearly than he ever would, because a man who thinks you matter does not silence the only thing between you and help. I left the bedroom without slamming anything and braced myself over the kitchen counter while another contraction bent me forward, hard enough to blur the room. The first car service app stalled. The second spun, and the third pinned a driver too far downtown, each useless minute tightening what Trent had already made plain upstairs. By the time I pulled on soft pants, shoved my insurance card and charger into my tote, and grabbed the hospital bag, I understood getting there was mine. Outside, the air felt damp and cold against my face, and the driveway lights flashed across the hood as I unlocked my Range Rover and slid behind the wheel. I sat through one contraction gripping the leather, then backed into the empty street with both hands fixed tight because pain made precision feel safer than panic. When the hospital valet looked at me and asked, "Are you alone?" I answered, "Yes," because Trent had already answered for himself an hour earlier without leaving the bed. By morning, the room had gone pale around us, and Noah's breathing against my chest was the first steady thing I had trusted in hours. My phone lit up at 6:14 with Trent's name, and when I opened the message, all it said was, "Everything okay?" As if the night had been weather. I read it twice, then turned the screen face down beside me, because that sentence told me exactly how he planned to remember what he had done. A little later, another text came through, shorter and colder in its own way, telling me to let him know when I was discharged because he had a full day. I did not answer that one either, and instead I opened our banking app with Noah still asleep against me. Not from instinct, but because the second message sounded like a man already organizing distance. The account loaded. The balances looked normal at first glance, and then I saw the transfers. Small amounts leaving regularly for an account I did not recognize. Once I opened the transaction history, the pattern held too cleanly to dismiss, stretching back months in sums, designed to look forgettable until they were lined beside each other. One transfer matched the same week as a furniture confirmation I had seen in our shared inbox. Another landed the morning after a River North valet charge he had called donor hosting. I did not need a confession once the numbers began repeating, because money moving quietly on purpose has its own grammar, and I could suddenly read all of it. I called Taryn Webb before I called anyone else, and when her receptionist picked up, I kept my voice level and asked for the first available appointment. Taryn came on later, listened without interrupting, and then said, "Do not confront him. Do not move money, and start documenting everything," which was the first instruction all night that made the room feel stable. When the nurse returned with discharge paperwork and paused at the emergency contact line, I wrote my own name there without hesitation, because between the texts and the transfers, Trent had already removed himself. I did not bring Noah back into the townhouse as a woman waiting for an explanation, and that difference was the first thing that made the place feel structurally sound again. Taryn had already confirmed the home sat inside my premarital trust. So when I called the locksmith from the hospital parking garage, I was not improvising anger. I was enforcing title. By noon, he had rekeyed the front, back, and garage entries, reset the smart lock access, and handed me a receipt with a timestamp that mattered more than any apology Trent might try later. While Noah slept in the bassinet beside the kitchen banquette, I changed every password tied to the house, the cameras, the garage, the billing portals, and the shared calendar. Then I opened a folder on my laptop called April Week 1 and started dropping in screenshots, statements, login alerts, and the 2 texts Trent had sent after leaving me alone to deliver his son. Once the evidence sat together in one place, the shape of his plan stopped feeling marital and started feeling operational. Because the same man who turned off his phone had also been thinning our money by design. Taryn sent notice that all substantive communication needed to go through counsel, and within an hour, Judith left a voicemail urging me not to turn one stressful week into permanent damage. I saved that message next to the banking records, because the words matched the pattern exactly. Minimize the act. Manage the woman. Preserve the man. When I pulled the lease confirmation for the River North apartment from a buried vendor email and matched it to the furniture charges Trent had buried as donor hospitality, Mallory stopped being a suspicion and became part of the file. By late afternoon, Trent texted, "I'll come by tonight to see the baby." And what hit me hardest was not the nerve, but the assumption buried inside the sentence. He was still writing himself as a father arriving, not a husband who had already abandoned the first arrival that mattered. I did not answer, because the locks were changed. The record was clean. The money trail was real. And for the first time in years, I was no longer participating in his version first. When I opened the door that evening, Noah was asleep against my chest, and Trent stood there in a navy coat with Judith on one side and Victor Ames on the other. Mallory Keene hovered a half step behind them in a cream sweater, carrying the careful expression of a woman who wanted to look incidental inside a situation she already knew too much about. Trent glanced first at me, then at Noah, and said, "I'm here to see my son," with the same practiced calm he used before entering rooms where money mattered. Judith tightened both hands around her purse and breathed. "Lydia, this is absurd. We are not standing out here like strangers." While Victor stayed quiet and let the silence do its work. I shifted Noah higher against my shoulder and answered, "You're not coming inside," because the new lock behind me and the notice from Taryn had already settled that question. Trent tried again. "Lower now. Let's not do this on the porch." But he had brought his mother, his boss, and Mallory to my front door, which meant he had already chosen the porch. Then he looked past me and asked, "Where is he?" As if arrival could erase absence. And that was the moment I stopped hearing anything but the sentence itself. I held his gaze and said, "What baby?" Then let Judith's sharp inhale land before I finished. "The one you told me to take a car service for at 2 in the morning. Victor's eyes moved to Trent at once. Not shocked, exactly. Just newly attentive. And Trent let out a thin laugh before saying, "I was half asleep." I could still see his hand turning the phone face down. So I gave him the times instead of the feeling. Because times are harder to charm. "At 2:11 my water broke. At 2:19, you told me to call a car. At 2:21, you shut your phone off. And at 6:14, you texted. Everything okay?" Mallory stepped in too fast and breathed. "You told me she had the baby later." And the minute those words left her mouth, Victor understood she had not come as a bystander. Judith turned on Trent with a look I had not seen before, the look of a woman realizing dignity could not survive documentation. Victor asked one clean question about the River North apartment and the expenses filed as donor hospitality. And Trent's face changed before he managed, "That's not what this is." I kept my voice even and said, "You can request any contact through counsel." Then closed the door on the man who had arrived too late with too many witnesses and still thought performance could outrun a record. Taryn moved first, which mattered. Because once Victor had heard the apartment question on my porch, this was no longer a marriage argument, trying to dress itself as confusion. She filed clean, opened discovery, separated the townhouse from anything Trent might try to blur into marital convenience, and flagged the transfers for what they were. I did not post. hint, vent, or recruit sympathy, because the texts, the lease, and the expense trail were already doing more damage than anger ever could. Victor did not call me after that night, but he did not need to, because certain decisions in Chicago money circles announce themselves through silence before they reach paper. Trent stopped appearing in donor photos. Mallory's name disappeared from 2 event rosters I had seen earlier that spring. And one board wife who never liked drama stopped returning her messages. Judith tried once more with a voicemail about family dignity and public restraint, and I archived it next to the earlier one because repetition, too, becomes evidence when the language never changes. Trent shifted tactics the minute the legal route stopped bending for him, and his messages moved from polished to wounded, then from wounded to strategic. One day, he wrote, "You're making this extreme." The next he tried, "We can handle this privately." And after that came, "I made a mistake," which sounded different only because the fallout had arrived. I answered once, through counsel and in the driest language possible, that all parenting communication would remain formal and all other issues would proceed through the existing channel. The supervised visit happened weeks later in a room designed to keep feeling from contaminating record, with neutral chairs, a side table, and no softness except Noah. Trent took him carefully, almost reverently, and whispered, "I didn't know," while Noah settled against him with the indifference babies reserved for adults who arrive late. I watched Trent hold the weight he had refused at 2:11 inches the morning, and because the file already contained the time, the texts, and the money, I did not need to argue with the lie. By then, the order of consequence had fixed itself exactly the way Taryn promised it would if I stayed consistent and kept the record cleaner than Trent kept his story. First came the paperwork, then the disclosures, then the loss of access, then the loss of sponsorship, and only after that did the social world begin doing what it always does when a polished man's judgment becomes expensive. I never had to ruin him in public, because once the law had named the shape of what he did, the rooms he cared about finished the sentence for me. Weeks later, the townhouse sounded different. Not bigger or brighter, just honest. Because every code, bill, and locked door now answered to me instead of to Trent's moods. I took fewer private entertaining jobs and kept only the clients who respected time, contracts, and boundaries, which meant the money came in cleaner and the house felt lighter. Noah slept in the nursery off the kitchen, and every ordinary sound around him, the kettle, the dishwasher, the quiet click of lamps, belonged to a life nobody else was managing for me. One night I woke at 2:11, looked straight at the clock, and felt no panic at all, only the strange calm that comes after a number loses power. That mattered because the file was closed enough. The accounts were clear enough, and Trent's access to both my time and my home now had terms. Judith stopped calling after the second formal warning from counsel. Mallory vanished from the rooms where she had hoped to rise, and Victor replaced Trent without ceremony. The supremacy was not dramatic, which was exactly why it held, because nothing in my new life depended on being believed by people who had watched me suffer politely. Trent still existed where the paperwork required him to exist, but he no longer moved through my world as husband, narrator, or the man people deferred to first. When I rocked Noah in the blue chair near the window and whispered, "I'm here," I knew the sentence meant more than comfort. It meant governance. If this story stayed with you, maybe it is because some endings do not announce themselves with noise. They arrive the moment evidence finally outweighs hope. If you have ever stood in a quiet house and realized you were the only adult protecting your own peace, I hope you keep choosing that peace. Thank you for staying with me through this one, and wherever life has left you tender. I hope you find something steady, kind, and unafraid to love you back.